The wedding veil still smelled of lavender when Molly heard her husband whisper another woman's name in his sleep. She had been awake for hours, sitting at the edge of the wide canopied bed, watching the single candle on the iron stand burn itself thinner. The chamber was cold despite the fire in the hearth, cold in the way that stone walls are always cold, indifferent to whatever warmth humans try to press against them. 3 days. That was how long she had been the wife of Lord Cedric Vane, Beta Lord of the Northern Reaches, son of a powerful council family, and the man her stepmother had chosen for her, with the same casual efficiency one uses when selecting a horse at the market. 3 days, and already she was counting candles in the dark. She told herself it meant nothing. Names surfaced in sleep like debris in river water. Fragments, echoes, things that had once mattered and refused to fully sink. She pulled her wool shawl tighter around her shoulders, pale blonde braid falling forward over her collarbone, and breathed slowly through the ache settling behind her sternum. He chose you, she reminded herself. He signed the parchment. He placed the ring. But the name he had murmured, Seraphine, was not hers. Molly rose before dawn, as she had done every morning since childhood. Her feet found the cold flagstones without flinching. She was 23 years old and had learned very early that the floor was always cold, that warmth had to be earned, that the women in her family were expected to smile through discomfort, as though discomfort were simply the weather. She dressed herself without calling for a handmaid. Her gray linen gown, her soft leather belt, her braid repinned, and slipped into the corridor before the household woke. The Vane Manor was a heavy thing, all dark oak and tapestried walls, and the faint smell of tallow smoke embedded in every curtain. Molly had been told it was distinguished. She thought it smelled like something trying too hard to appear grand. She walked to the eastern window at the end of the corridor, the one that overlooked the kitchen garden, and pressed her fingertips against the leaded glass. Outside, frost whitened the herb beds. Rosemary and sage stood silver and brittle in the early gray light. She had no wolf. That was the truth she carried like a stone beneath her ribs, the truth that had defined every conversation about her worth, her rank, her marriage prospects. An omega without a wolf. Not shifted, not connected, not howling at anything. The healers had called it a dormancy. Her stepmother, Lady Corva, had called it an embarrassment. Cedric's family had called it acceptable, given the dowry. Molly had learned to call it nothing at all. She had learned that silence was the most efficient armor. She was still at the window when she heard the voices. They came from the study below, a room she had not yet been invited into, though it sat directly beneath her feet. The floor was old, and the stone carried sound like a whisper through water. She had not meant to listen. She had not even understood at first what she was hearing. But then a word reached her clearly, her name, and her body went very still. Molly will be gone before the first moon of spring. The voice was Cedric's. She did not breathe. The frost outside blurred at the edges of her vision, or perhaps that was her own eyes failing her. She pressed one hand flat against the cold glass and made herself stay absolutely motionless, because moving might mean missing a single syllable, and she needed every syllable. The council will accept the inheritance clause once she is declared unfit. An omega without a wolf is already half a ghost in the eyes of the law. A pause. Corva assured me the documentation is already prepared. Another voice, older, drier, the kind that sounded like it had spent decades counting coins. And if she proves resistant, she won't. Cedric's tone carried no cruelty in it, which was worse somehow than cruelty would have been. It was simply a man discussing logistics. She trusts. That has always been her weakness. She was raised to be grateful, and she is. It makes everything simpler. Molly's hand slid down the glass very slowly. Her father had died 4 years ago, leaving behind a title, a modest territory, and a sealed inheritance trust that passed to his only legitimate daughter upon her 25th year. unless she was declared mentally or physically unfit by a recognized council. The territory was not large, but it was positioned at a crossing between 3 pack roads, and 3 pack roads meant tolls, and tolls meant wealth that compounded quietly and steadily, year after year. She had known the territory existed. She had not known, until this moment, that it was the only reason anyone had ever agreed to marry her. She had not known that her stepmother and her new husband had apparently been working together for longer than the engagement. She had not known that unfit was already being written somewhere in official ink. The fire in the hearth down the corridor crackled. The sound seemed very far away. Molly became aware that her jaw was clenched so tightly her teeth ached, and that the wool shawl around her shoulders had become insufficient against a cold that had nothing to do with stone or weather. She walked back to the chamber. She did not run. Running would have required her legs to agree on a direction, and her legs were not yet certain of anything. She sat on the edge of the bed again, hands folded in her lap, and looked at the candle. It had burned down to almost nothing. A thin column of pale wax. Nearly gone. She trusts. That has always been her weakness. The words moved through her like something swallowed wrong, sharp and lodging in the wrong place. Because he was not incorrect. She had trusted. She had been taught that trust was the appropriate response to kindness, and she had read every gesture of kindness in her marriage as evidence that perhaps, this arrangement could become something real. The way he had poured her wine without being asked. The way he had asked once whether the journey had exhausted her. Small things. She had gathered them like someone gathering crumbs, telling herself it was enough. It had been performance. She understood that now with the flat, airless clarity of someone who has just walked into a wall in the dark. She stood. She did not allow herself to sit back down. The small traveling chest at the foot of the bed held the only things she had brought that were truly hers. Her father's old seal ring, wrapped in linen. A short letter he had written her on her 16th birthday, worn at the folds from being read too many times. A small glass vial of dried lavender her mother had pressed before she died, which Molly kept not for sentiment exactly, but because it was the only physical proof she had ever been loved without condition. She tucked all 3 items into the inner pocket of her riding cloak. Then she waited. She waited with her cloak on, and her boots laced and her braid redone tightly, sitting in the chair by the cold hearth, watching the door. She had perhaps 2 hours before the household rose fully. The groom who tended the eastern stable had always seemed indifferent to her existence, which meant he was unlikely to ask questions if she requested a horse at an unusual hour. She was not certain where she was going. The northern reaches were Vane territory, and beyond them, the roads split toward the Ashford border in one direction, and the deep forest passage toward the Crown territories in another. She knew no one in either direction. She had no coin beyond what she had sewn into the hem of her riding skirt months ago, a habit her father had quietly encouraged when she was young. Always keep something for yourself, Molly. Always. She had thought him overly cautious. She sent a silent, belated apology toward his memory. The candle went out on its own just before she rose to leave. She did not take it as an omen. She simply walked to the door in the dark, opened it without sound, and stepped into the corridor. The manor was still sleeping. The tapestries breathed faintly in the draught from a loose shutter somewhere above. The smell of tallow was thicker near the staircase, and beneath it, old stone. And beneath that, something she had never noticed before, a faint trace of something sweet and wrong, like honeyed water left too long in a warm room. She filed that detail away without understanding it yet, and kept walking. Outside, frost crunched softly under her boots. The eastern stable was 30 paces across the courtyard. The sky above the manor walls was not yet light, but it was no longer fully dark either. That particular gray that belongs to no hour, the one that asks nothing and promises nothing. Molly crossed the courtyard in 28 steps. She counted them. It helped. The groom looked up from a hay bale, blinked at her, and, as she had calculated, asked nothing at all when she requested the smaller brown mare, the one with the mild temperament and the quiet hooves. She rode out through the servants' gate before the bell in the manor tower struck the first hour. She did not look back. Not because she was strong enough to resist it, but because she already knew what she would see. A house that had never been a home, still sleeping, still pretending. The road ahead was frost-pale and empty. And somewhere in the forest beyond the reaches, she heard, or imagined she heard, a wolf howl once, low and distant, as though something ancient had noticed her moving through the dark. The brown mare's breath came in small clouds, rising and dissolving in the cold air as Molly pushed her steadily along the frost-hardened road. The trees thickened on either side as the northern reaches gave way to the outer woodland, pines tall enough to block what little gray light the morning offered, their resin sharp in her nostrils, clean and honest in a way the Vane Manor had never been. She had not cried. She was aware of this as a fact rather than a source of pride. The tears were there. She could feel their weight somewhere behind her eyes, but they seemed to understand that now was not the time. There was a practicality to grief that no one warned you about, the way it steps aside when survival requires full attention, waiting politely in the corridor until you have a moment to receive it. She had perhaps 4 hours before Cedric discovered her gone, possibly less, if Seraphine, whoever she was expected that morning. Molly pressed her heels gently against the mare's sides and chose the forest road rather than the main path. The main path was wider, faster, and watched. Every toll station between the reaches and the Ashford border would have a man who knew Vane colors. The forest road was slower, rougher, and led eventually to the Old Crown Passage, the one that crossed through contested territory before opening onto the lands held directly under the authority of the High Council, and above them, the Lycan throne itself. She had never been to the Crown territories. She had never had reason to go. But she carried her father's seal ring, and her father had once told her, with the particular gravity he reserved for important things, that the old blood laws still held weight in Crown territory. A legitimate heir under threat could petition directly. It was ancient law, older than most of the noble families currently sitting on the High Council, and therefore harder to quietly erase. She was clinging to that, the way one clings to a railing in a strong wind, not certain it would hold, but holding anyway. The forest deepened around her. The pine smell gave way to something earthier, wet bark, cold moss, the dark mineral scent of soil that had never fully dried since the last rain. A stream ran parallel to the path for a while, just audible through the undergrowth, its sound steadying. Birds she could not name moved in the upper branches. Once, a deer crossed the path ahead and paused to look at her with perfect calm before stepping back into the dark between the trees. She was perhaps 2 hours into the forest when the mare stopped. Not a stumble, not a spooked jump, just a complete and deliberate halt, as though the animal had arrived somewhere and had no intention of continuing. Molly pressed her heels again. The mare did not move. She shifted in the saddle, looking ahead along the path. The fog had come up while she wasn't watching. It sat low and dense between the trees, the kind that made distances impossible to judge. Somewhere within it, the path curved and she could not see what lay beyond the curve. Then she heard it. Not a howl this time. Something quieter. Voices. Male voices, low and controlled. The particular register of men who are accustomed to not being questioned. And beneath those voices, the sound of horses. Multiple horses, heavier than her mare, the kind that carried armored riders. Molly pulled the mare off the path and into the tree line in one quiet movement, pressing herself low against the animal's neck, her gray cloak blending with reasonable adequacy into the fog and the dark tree trunks. She told herself to breathe slowly. She told herself that not every group of armed riders on a forest road was looking for her specifically. She counted 4 horses as they emerged through the fog, then a 5th, and a sixth. And then, slightly apart from the others, a seventh, carrying a rider who sat differently from the rest. Not stiffly, not with the performed posture of someone who wanted to look important. He sat the way mountains sit, as though movement were a choice he made deliberately each time, and stillness was simply the default. He was tall in the saddle, broad through the shoulders, wearing a leather riding coat with a dark fur collar that caught the mist in fine droplets. His hair was dark, braided close along the top and falling in longer plaits past his jaw, and his eyes, the ones that turned without apparent urgency directly to the tree line where Molly was attempting to be invisible, were the pale, clear gray of winter ice. He looked at her for a long moment without expression. She did not move. Her heart was doing something unreasonable against her ribs, but her face, she believed, was composed. One of the armored riders moved toward the tree line with a hand on his sword hilt. The man on the seventh horse raised 2 fingers, a minimal gesture, and the rider stopped. "Come out." The voice was quiet, not threatening, or rather threatening in the way that absolute certainty is threatening, because it leaves no room for argument. "You are on a borrowed horse with a lord's stable marking on the saddle blanket, wearing a traveling cloak in vain colors, alone, in a forest that is not safe at this hour. Whatever you are running from, you will not outrun it by hiding behind a pine tree." Molly straightened in the saddle. She considered her options with the rapid and unsentimental efficiency she had developed over years of living in a household where being caught unprepared was a form of failure. She could attempt to flee further into the forest, which she rejected immediately. His horses were heavier and faster, and she did not know this terrain. She could lie, which was complicated by the fact that he had already accurately described her situation in 3 sentences. Or she could emerge, assess, and adapt. She emerged. The mare stepped back onto the path with the dignified air of an animal that had been right about something and knew it. Molly sat straight, her braid over one shoulder, her hands visible and still, and looked at the man directly. She had learned early that looking away was a form of confession. Up close, he was significant. That was the only word her mind produced initially, which she found irritating. Significant in the way that a storm front is significant, not because it announces itself loudly, but because everything around it becomes secondary. The pale gray eyes moved over her with the same comprehensive, quiet attention he might give a document he was deciding whether to trust. "You are not vain, Pack," he said. It was not a question. "No," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect. "I was vain by marriage. For 3 days." Something shifted in his expression. Not softness exactly, but an adjustment, the way a calculation changes when a new number enters it. "And now?" "And now I am leaving." One of his riders leaned toward another and said something low. The man on the 7th horse did not look at his riders. He kept his gaze on her, and she had the uncomfortable sensation of being read very accurately by someone who had no reason to find her worth the effort. "You are heading toward Crown territory on the old passage," he said. "That road is not maintained. There are 3 river crossings between here and the border marker, and 2 of them have no bridge since the autumn floods." "I am aware," she said, which was not entirely true, but she was not going to admit that. "You are not aware," he said, with the same quiet certainty as before, and she felt a flicker of irritation that was almost a relief. Irritation was clean and manageable in a way that grief was not. "Then I will manage," she said. He studied her for another moment. Then he turned to the rider on his left. "Check the crossing at Marin's Fork. If it's passable, she'll need to know before she attempts it alone." He turned back to her. "What is your name?" She hesitated. Names were information, and information given to strangers in forests was a risk. "Molly," she said finally. "Daughter of Lord Aldrich of the Thornfield holding. Legitimate heir and current target of a conspiracy I am in the process of surviving. She had not planned to say that last part. It came out because she was exhausted and cold, and the honest version of herself was very close to the surface this morning. The man on the 7th horse looked at her for a long, still moment. And then, briefly, barely, something moved at the corner of his mouth that might, in different light, have been the beginning of a reaction he chose not to complete. "Orion," he said, "King of the Lycan territories and current holder of the crown seat." The word king landed in her chest like a stone dropped into still water, sending rings outward in every direction. She held perfectly still while those rings moved through her, because if she allowed herself to react visibly, she would have to decide how to react. And she was not yet certain what the correct reaction was. The Alpha King of the Lycan territories was sitting on a horse in a foggy forest, looking at her as though she were an equation he was deciding whether to solve. "I see," she said. "You are safe for the moment," he said. "My party will escort you to the nearest way station. From there, we will discuss what you mean by conspiracy and what you intend to do about it." She wanted to say that she did not require an escort, that she was managing, that she had a plan. She wanted to say several things that pride suggested would be appropriate. But the forest was cold, the fog was thickening, and somewhere behind her on a frost-pale road, a man who had described her trust as a weakness was going to wake up and discover her absence. "Thank you," she said instead, and meant it more than she was comfortable with. The king turned his horse toward the crown passage without fanfare, and his riders fell into formation around her mare with the practiced quiet of men who had done this 1,000 times before. Molly rode among them and tried to determine whether she had escaped one trap or simply entered another. She did not have an answer yet. But the resin on the air was clean, and somewhere ahead, the fog was beginning, just slightly, to thin. The way station was not a grand structure. It was a long, low building of pale stone tucked against a hillside where the forest thinned, with a stable attached and a single chimney releasing a thin thread of wood smoke into the gray morning sky. It smelled of pine resin, dried herbs, and the particular animal warmth of horses kept close. Molly found it, in spite of everything, a relief. It was honest in the way that functional things are honest, built for purpose, not for impression. Orion's riders secured the horses with efficient silence. 2 posted themselves outside the entrance without being told. The others dispersed with the quiet coordination of men who had learned to move through the world without taking up unnecessary space. Molly dismounted on her own before anyone could offer assistance, a small insistence on her own capability that she recognized as slightly foolish, given that her legs were stiff from cold and urgency. She managed it without visible difficulty and was unreasonably satisfied by this. Inside, a way station keeper, a compact, older man with a gray beard and the unhurried expression of someone accustomed to hosting unusual parties at unusual hours, stoked the central fire without comment, and produced a tray with bread, hard cheese, and a clay pitcher of something warm that turned out to be spiced cider. Molly sat at the long wooden table closest to the fire and wrapped both hands around the clay cup and let the warmth move up through her palms. Orion sat across from her. He had removed the fur-collared riding coat, and beneath it wore a dark leather vest over a heavy linen shirt, with bracers of worn leather buckled to his forearms. The informal attire made him look, if anything, more authoritative rather than less, the way that some people look more themselves when the ceremonial layers are removed. He poured cider into his own cup and did not speak immediately. She had noticed that about him already, the way he used silence as a tool rather than an absence. Most men in positions of power she had encountered filled space with their voice. He seemed to understand that silence asked more questions than speech did. "Tell me about the conspiracy," he said finally, without preamble. She told him, efficiently, without ornamentation. She was aware as she spoke that she was giving information to a man she had known for less than 2 hours, but the arithmetic of her situation was straightforward. She had no allies, no resources beyond a sealed ring and a hemline of coin, and the man sitting across from her was the highest authority in these lands. Sentiment was a luxury. She could not afford to hoard information, and also survive. She told him about the inheritance trust, the territorial holding, the 3-pack roads and their toll revenues. She told him about Lord Cedric and Lady Corva, and the conversation she had heard through the cold stone floor. She told him about the phrase declared unfit, and the documentation apparently already in preparation. She told him about 3 days of marriage, and one name murmured in sleep. She did not tell him about the lavender vial in her pocket, or the letter, or her father's voice saying always keep something for yourself. Some things were not information. Some things were just hers. When she finished, the fire crackled, and the cider steamed, and Orion looked at her with those ice-gray eyes that gave away very little. "You heard one conversation," he said. "Yes, through a floor. Stone carries sound, particularly at that hour when the manor is otherwise silent. You could have misheard." "I could have," she said. "I did not." He considered this. "What do you know about the Thornfield Holdings' legal standing under Crown law?" "I know that a legitimate heir with a sealed inheritance document can petition the Crown directly if she has reason to believe the document is under threat. I know this law is older than most of the current council families. I know it is therefore more difficult to quietly dismiss." Something in his expression shifted. Not surprise exactly, but a recalibration. "You know your law." "My father taught me. He said a woman who does not know the law is a woman who depends on others to interpret it for her, and interpretation is where rights go to disappear." She had not quoted her father to anyone since his death. The words came out clearly, and then sat in the air between them, and she felt their weight more than she had anticipated. She took a sip of cider and let the silence absorb them. "Lord Aldrich of Thornfield," Orion said, with the tone of someone consulting an internal record. "He died 4 years ago. Fever, according to the council report." "Yes." He looked at her steadily. "According to the council report," he repeated, with a particular weight on the word according. Molly set down her cup. She had not allowed herself to examine that particular caveat before. Grief had sealed it behind other, more immediate concerns. The stepmother's arrival, the changed household, the swift and efficient replacement of her father's quiet authority with Lady Corva's version of management. She had been 23 and alone, and the grief had been large enough to fill the available space without leaving room for suspicion. But the man across from her had just placed a careful, deliberate finger on something she had been choosing not to look at for 4 years. "What are you suggesting?" she asked. Her voice was very steady. She was proud of that, and also slightly frightened by it. "Nothing yet," he said. "I am noting that Lord Aldrich of Thornfield died at a convenient moment for Lady Corva's ambitions, that the illness was reportedly rapid, and that the healer who attended him was from a family with documented council connections." He paused. "I am noting facts. What you do with the pattern they form is your decision." She looked at the fire for a moment. The logs were old oak, and they burned steadily and without drama. "He was not sick before she came," Molly said quietly. "In the 2 years before he died, he was entirely well. The fever came suddenly. Within a fortnight, he was gone." She had said this before, to herself, in the quiet of various sleepless nights, and had always found a way to fold it back into grief rather than suspicion. It was painful enough to lose a father. To consider that the loss had been engineered was a different category of terrible entirely. Orion did not offer her comfort. She found she did not want comfort exactly. What she wanted, and what he was providing, was simply the room to speak a thing plainly and have it heard without being softened into something more manageable. "My brother," she said, and stopped. He waited. "My younger brother, Evan. He was 16 when our father died." Lady Corva said he had been sent to a training hold in the Eastern Territories. A pack education, she called it. She said he had requested it himself. Molly's hands tightened slightly around the cup. I received one letter from him 3 months after he left. It was brief. The handwriting was his, but the phrasing was wrong. He was warm in his letters, particular. He would describe what he had eaten for breakfast, and what the sky looked like, and whether the training master's dog had done something amusing. The letter I received was formal and without detail. You kept it. Yes. I will want to read it. She looked at him. Why? Because, he said, if your brother is being held somewhere against his will, that changes the nature of this matter considerably. It is no longer a property dispute with irregular documentation. It becomes unlawful confinement of a noble heir, which carries significantly different weight before the High Council. And before me. The fire popped. Outside, one of the horses shifted and stamped. Somewhere in the way station's upper loft, a shutter was loose and knocked faintly against its frame in the wind. Molly reached into the inner pocket of her riding cloak, past the lavender vial, past her father's letter, and retrieved the folded square of parchment she had carried without fully understanding why for 3 years. She placed it on the table. She did not slide it across. She set it down and let it be a decision she had already made. He did not reach for it immediately. He looked at her first. You do not trust me, he said, not an accusation. I trusted my stepmother, she said. I trusted my husband for 3 days. My trust does not have a distinguished history. That is fair. But you are the king, and the law gives you jurisdiction, and I am running out of alternatives. She met his eyes. So this is not trust. This is strategy. The corner of his mouth moved again. The same almost reaction she had seen on the forest road. The one he seemed to choose not to complete. That, he said, is also fair. He picked up the letter and read it. She watched his face as he read and saw nothing that was not already there. That same careful, comprehensive attention, moving through the parchment the way a hand moves over a map, checking for terrain. When he set it down, his expression had not changed, but something behind his eyes had. There is a garrison post 4 hours north of here, he said. It falls under direct Crown authority. I have a council session in the capital that I can delay by 2 days without raising questions. He looked at her directly. I want to send a messenger to the Eastern Territories under my seal. A quiet inquiry regarding the whereabouts of one Evan of Thornfield, ward of Lady Corva. If he is at the training hold, we will know within 5 days. If he is not, Molly said, then we will know something worse and considerably more useful. Yes. She looked at the fire again. The oak burned down to coals that glowed amber and deep red, steady and patient. Why are you doing this? She asked. The question came out without the armor she usually placed around vulnerable things, and she did not take it back. Orion was quiet for a moment, genuinely quiet, not calculating quiet. Because what you are describing is a systematic abuse of the inheritance laws that my family wrote, he said. Because a woman alone on a frost road at dawn with her father's seal ring sewn into her cloak is owed at least a competent audience. Another pause, shorter, and because you told me your name was Molly and that you were in the process of surviving. I found that precise. She did not know what to do with that. She filed it away carefully, in the same interior place where she kept things that might matter later. The garrison post, she said. Can we leave this morning? Within the hour, he said. Rest first. Eat something. The road north is rough, and I would prefer you arrive capable of standing. It was not a gentle instruction. It was simply accurate. She ate the bread and the hard cheese, and finished the cider, and the fire burned its steady amber, and outside the fog was lifting by degrees, revealing slowly the shape of the trees and the road, and the pale sky beginning, finally, to lighten. The garrison post at Caldermere was built into the side of a granite ridge, its walls the same pale stone as the rock behind it, so that at a distance it appeared to grow from the hillside rather than having been constructed upon it. It was a working military outpost, functional, spare, smelling of leather oil and iron and the particular cold that lived in stone buildings, regardless of how many fires were lit inside. Molly found it reassuring in the same way she had found the way station reassuring. Nothing here was performing. She'd been given a small chamber on the upper corridor, with a narrow bed, a wool blanket, a basin of water, and a south-facing window that let in a strip of pale afternoon light. It was the most private space she had occupied in months, and she sat in it for a long time without doing anything at all, letting the silence have its weight. The tears came then. She had known they would eventually. They were not dramatic. No heaving, no sound. Just a steady and businesslike release, as though her body had been waiting for a private room to complete a necessary task. She let them run their course, dried her face with the edge of her sleeve, and then stood and went to the window. The ridge below the garrison was dusted with frost that the midday sun had not touched. Pine trees ran along its base in a dark, uneven line. Somewhere beyond them, invisible from here, was the road she had ridden that morning. It seemed further away than hours explained. She had been a married woman on that road. She supposed she still was, technically. That thought had a particularly unpleasant texture, and she set it aside to examine later when she had more information about what later would look like. A knock at the chamber door brought a young guardsman carrying a fresh tray, warm broth, rye bread, a small pot of honey, and behind him, unexpectedly, a woman. She was perhaps 50, with a round, weathered face and sharp brown eyes, wearing the plain gray dress and white apron of a garrison healer. She introduced herself as Marta, said the king had asked her to check on the guest, and then proceeded to do so with the thorough and unsentimental efficiency of someone who had spent decades treating people who did not want to admit they needed treating. "You are exhausted," Marta said, as though reporting a measurement. "Yes," Molly agreed. "You have been cold for hours. Your hands are still pale." "I rode in frost before dawn." "Eat the broth. Sleep this afternoon if you can. There is nothing that will be resolved faster by your being unwell." Marta set a small bundle of dried herbs on the windowsill, lavender and something sharper, valerian perhaps, and gave her a look that contained both practicality and, unexpectedly, a thread of warmth. "You are safe in this building. I have worked here for 19 years, and I can tell you with confidence that nothing enters these walls without the king's knowledge. Does that include me?" "Particularly you," Marta said, in a tone that implied this was notable, and then left before Molly could ask what she meant by it. She ate the broth and thought about that. The messenger returned on the 4th day. Molly was in the garrison's small library, a single room lined with heavy ledgers and territorial maps and a few bound chronicles, all of which smelled wonderfully of old parchment and dust. When Orion's voice came from the corridor, low and direct, requesting her presence in the council room. She had seen him only briefly in the intervening days. He had been occupied, riders coming and going at all hours, sealed documents exchanged, quiet conversations that ceased when she passed. He had not excluded her deliberately, she sensed that. But he had also not sought her out, and she had been grateful for the space, using it to sleep properly for the first time in recent memory, and to begin mapping, on a piece of parchment the garrison steward had provided, everything she knew about her father's territory, her stepmother's movements, and the timeline of the inheritance documents. The council room was low-ceilinged and map-covered, with a long oak table and candles burning in iron holders along the walls. Orion stood at the far end, one hand resting flat on the table, reading a document that he set down when she entered. 2 of his senior riders. She had learned their names. Davin, his second commander, lean and careful, with a veteran's economy of movement, and Holt, the eldest, whose gray-streaked beard gave him the look of someone who had seen enough to stop being surprised by anything, stood to either side. "The messenger returned from the Eastern Territories," Orion said, without preface. "And?" She stood at the other end of the table. She had learned not to sit until she understood the nature of what she was receiving. It was easier to absorb difficult things on her feet. "There is no record of Evan of Thornfield at any training hold in the Eastern Territories. Not current, not historical. His name does not appear in any garrison ledger, any pack education roll, or any ward registration document." She had prepared herself for this. She had known, on some quiet level, since the night she had found that formal and wrong-feeling letter, that this was what the truth looked like. But preparation and arrival are different things, and she felt the information settle through her with a weight that preparation had not diminished. "Where is he?" she asked. "We do not know yet," Orion said, "but we know where he is not. And we know one more thing." He turned the document on the table so it faced her and slid it forward. "The messenger made a secondary inquiry at my instruction into the death of Lord Aldrich of Thornfield. The healer who attended him, a man named Perith, died 8 months after your father. The official record says fever, but Perith's apprentice is still living in a village 2 days east of the Thornfield holding, and he spoke to the messenger." Molly walked to the table and read the document. Her eyes moved over the words at a steady pace, and the room was very quiet. The apprentice's account was careful, hedged with uncertainty. He was a young man clearly afraid of the implications of what he was saying, but the substance was plain. Healer Perith had confided in him, a week before his own death, that the fever he had treated was not a natural fever, that the progression had been wrong, too fast, too specific, targeting the shift capability first before spreading, that he had found traces of a plant compound in the water vessels beside the sick man's bed, a compound he had not placed there, that he had been paid to declare it a natural illness, and had done so, and had regretted it every day since. Molly straightened up from the document. Her father had not died of fever. Her father had been poisoned, and the man who had poisoned him had then been silenced before he could reconsider his silence. Lady Corva had been planning this for longer than Molly had understood, long enough to remove the father, hide the son, and marry the daughter to a man already positioned to have her declared unfit. It was not opportunism. It was architecture, built patiently, over years, using the tools of grief and trust, and the assumption that Molly, raised grateful and accommodating, would never look at the floor of her own grief and listen. "She will have moved to accelerate the documentation," Molly said. Her voice was entirely even. "When she discovers I am gone, she will push the council submission forward. She cannot afford to wait." "Agreed," Orion said. "Which means we have less time than we did 4 days ago." "Also agreed." "Can you convene a session of the High Council under Crown authority, not an appeal, a formal Crown inquiry, into the inheritance document, the apprentice's testimony, and the unlawful disappearance of a noble heir?" Davin made a low sound that was not quite a word. Holt looked at the ceiling briefly in the way of a man calculating risks. Orion looked at her. "I can," he said. "It is not a small action. A Crown inquiry into a council-connected family will create resistance and political cost." "I know," she said. "Is that a reason not to do it?" "No," he said simply. "I am informing you of the landscape, not suggesting we avoid it." She looked at him across the oak table with its scattered maps and its candle shadows. He looked back with the same steady, ice-gray attention that she had not yet found a way to categorize comfortably. It was not calculating exactly. It was more like the attention of someone who was genuinely present in the room rather than performing presence, which was, she was coming to understand, rarer than it should be. "There is something else," he said. She waited. "Your father's seal ring." He nodded toward her hand, where she wore it on her right forefinger. Old silver, the Thornfield mark, a stylized thorn above a field of 3 lines. Under blood law, a legitimate heir carrying the seal of a poisoned lord can initiate a formal claim of unlawful dispossession. It requires a blood witness, someone of crown rank who can attest to receiving the claim directly. He paused. I am the only crown rank witness available. You are saying you will witness my claim. I am saying the law provides for it, and I am willing. She looked at the ring. Her father's hands had been careful hands, a man who repaired his own books, who pressed his seal into wax with the concentration of someone who understood that marks, once made, mattered. Why? She asked again, the same question she had asked at the way station, because she needed to understand the answer more fully than she had before. He was quiet for a moment. Not evasive. She had learned to distinguish his silences. This was the silence of a man who was deciding how much honesty the moment could hold. My own mother, he said, died when I was 14. The official account said illness. I was an Alpha King's son, and I still could not get anyone to look at what I had found, because the people positioned to investigate were the same people who benefited from not investigating. His hand moved on the table, a small, almost imperceptible press of his fingers against the oak. No crown inquiry was initiated. I have carried that for 17 years. The candles burned. The maps lay open around them, full of roads and borders and territories that each held their own hidden weight. I am sorry, Molly said quietly. So am I, he said. For both of us. She removed her father's seal ring from her finger and held it in her palm for a moment. Then she set it on the table between them, not giving it up, not surrendering it, but marking it as the foundation of something formal and deliberate and real. Then let us begin, she said. Davin straightened. Holt turned from the ceiling. Orion reached for the ring and held it carefully, the way her father had always held it, and began to speak the words of blood witness in the old Lycan tongue, each syllable precise and weighted, binding the claim to crown record in a way that could not be quietly dismissed or conveniently lost. Outside the garrison walls, the frost had finally broken. The temperature was rising. Somewhere in the pine forest below the ridge, snowmelt was beginning to run, thin and cold and inexorable, finding its way downhill through every available channel, the way water always does when the season finally turns. The High Council of the Lycan territories convened in the Great Hall of Caldermere's crown seat, 11 days after Molly had ridden out of the Vane Manor on a borrowed horse in the dark. The hall was a vast, cold-breathed chamber of gray stone and vaulted timber, lit by iron chandeliers that held 50 candles each, their light pooling on the long council table and leaving the upper reaches of the room in shadow. The smell was beeswax and old wood, and the faint mineral sharpness of stone that had absorbed centuries of difficult decisions. Molly sat in the witness chair, not at the table, but facing it, which she had initially resisted and then accepted as tactically sound. She needed to be seen clearly. She wore a deep blue wool gown borrowed from the garrison's modest stores of formal attire, her pale blonde braid pinned up at the back of her neck, her father's seal ring on her right hand. She had slept properly for 9 days. She was not the woman who had counted candles in the dark. Lady Corva arrived under crown summons, which she could not refuse. She entered the hall with the particular composure of someone who has rehearsed a performance and believes in it completely. She was a tall woman, angular, with iron-gray hair and a manner that had always reminded Molly of a door being held shut from the other side, civil on the surface and absolutely unyielding beneath. Lord Cedric arrived separately, which told Molly that he had been given no time to coordinate with his mother-in-law before appearing. That had been Davin's arrangement, and she had found herself quietly grateful for his competence. The council was 12 members. 3 of them had documented connections to Corva's family network, a fact that Orion had identified and addressed before the session began by appointing 4 additional crown assessors. a right of the Lycan King in formal inquiry proceedings, and one that was unambiguously within his authority regardless of anyone's preference. The three connected members had said nothing about this visibly. Their silence had been expressive. Orion sat at the head of the table. He wore the formal attire of the crown seat, a deep charcoal tunic with silver thread borders, a dark fur mantle, the Lycan crown an unadorned band of dark iron that looked less like an ornament and more like a fact about him. He had the same quality in this room that he had on the forest road, the stillness that made everything around it slightly more orderly. The proceedings took 4 hours. The apprentice's testimony was read into the record. The apprentice himself had agreed to travel to Caldermere under crown protection, which Orion had arranged personally, and he gave his account aloud in a voice that shook only at the beginning and steadied as he continued, as though speaking the truth in a formal setting was itself a form of relief. Lady Corva's expression during his testimony did not change, which was, Molly had learned, how she managed all inconvenient information. She simply refused to receive it outwardly. The inheritance documents were examined. A crown scholar compared the seals and found that 2 of the supporting attestations carried dates that were inconsistent with the attesting lord's known whereabouts during those periods. One of those lords was deceased. The other, when questioned before the council, went pale in a way that answered the question before he spoke. The letter from Evan was entered into evidence alongside the garrison messenger's report from the Eastern Territories. Lord Cedric, questioned directly by the Crown assessors, lasted approximately 40 minutes before the coherence of his account began to collapse. He was not, Molly observed, a man built for sustained pressure. He had been built for situations where pressure was not applied, where trust and accommodation and a woman raised to be grateful provided enough soft ground to stand on. In a room full of people who were not accommodating him, he became someone much smaller and considerably less certain of anything. He did not confess. He carefully said nothing that constituted a direct admission. But he said enough inconsistent things that the pattern was plain to every person in the room. And when Orion looked at him at the end of his questioning, with the steady, comprehensive gaze that Molly had come to understand, meant I have already arrived at my conclusion, and I am simply allowing you the courtesy of the process. Cedric looked away first. Lady Corva did not look away. She met Orion's gaze with her door-held shut composure and said, clearly and without trembling, that she had acted in the best interests of the Thornfield holding, and that the claims against her were the inventions of a disobedient girl with an inflated sense of her own importance. The hall was entirely silent for a moment after she said this. Molly looked at her stepmother across the council table and felt something she had not expected. Not rage, which she had anticipated, and not grief, which she had also prepared for, but something closer to clarity. The kind that comes when a question you have been trying to answer for years finally resolves into a simple and irrefutable shape. Lady Corva had never seen her. Not as a person, not as a daughter of the house, not as someone whose existence had weight and cost. She had seen a mechanism, a legal instrument that could be used or discarded based on utility. That was not grief. That was just information, finally confirmed. Orion spoke his ruling with the same unhurried precision he brought to everything. The inheritance trust was to be restored to Molly in full, effective immediately, under Crown seal. The documentation prepared by Lady Corva and her associates was declared fraudulent and void. The council members with family connections to the conspiracy were suspended from their seats pending individual review. Lord Cedric's marriage claim was dissolved under the bad faith provisions of Lycan noble law, a clause that existed precisely because the law had always understood that agreements made under false pretense were not agreements. Lady Corva and Lord Cedric were remanded to Crown custody pending full investigation into the death of Lord Aldrich and the disappearance of Evan of Thornfield. When the ruling was complete, Molly became aware that she had been holding a steadiness in her chest for 4 hours that was now, very quietly, releasing. It did not feel like triumph exactly. It felt like the moment after a long fever breaks, exhausted, altered, and aware that the body has been through something real. Evan was found 12 days later. A Crown search party, acting on information extracted during Lady Corva's formal questioning, located him at a remote holding in the northern marshes, a place registered under a false name, staffed by 2 retainers who surrendered without resistance when they understood the authority they were facing. He was 20 years old and had been there for nearly 4 years, told repeatedly that his sister had been informed of his placement and agreed to it, told that attempting to leave would result in consequences for Molly. He had believed this because he had been given no reason not to, and because he was a young man with a good heart who had not yet learned to calculate the dimensions of other people's cruelty. When Molly arrived at the garrison courtyard where he was brought, he was thinner than she remembered and taller, and he looked at her for a long moment as though he was not entirely certain she was real. Then he crossed the courtyard in 4 strides, and she held on with the grip of someone who had carried the weight of not knowing for too long, and the grief that had been waiting in the corridor for years finally came fully into the room, and she let it, because it was the right time, and because he was there, and because some things cannot be processed in manageable pieces. They simply have to be felt whole. Marta, who had come along in the Crown party because she had decided to, placed a wool blanket around both their shoulders without comment, and went to organize warm food, which was exactly the right thing to do. The Thornfield holding was restored to Molly's name by the end of the winter month. She returned to it with Evan and 2 of Orion's guard, who remained stationed there by Crown arrangement, until the legal proceedings concluded and the territory was formally secured. The holding was smaller than she had remembered, and also more itself. The kitchen garden still grew rosemary and sage, the south-facing room still held warmth longer than the others, and her father's study still smelled of the pine resin he had used to seal his documents. She sat at his desk on the first evening and was quiet for a long time. She wrote a formal letter of gratitude to the Crown seat. She wrote it carefully and with precision, which she recognized as a way of managing the fact that gratitude was not, in this case, the complete or only thing she felt. She had spent a month in daily proximity to Orion, in garrison corridors, council rooms, over maps and legal documents, through formal proceedings and the informal spaces between them. She had learned the particular quality of his attention. She had learned that he noticed things without announcing that he had noticed them. She had learned that when he said he would do something, it was done, without the performance of promise that most men substituted for follow-through. She had also learned, slowly, and without wanting to, that being in a room with him felt different from being in a room without him. She had categorized this as pragmatic. He was a source of stability and resource during an unstable time. She had held that categorization firmly for as long as it remained plausible. It had stopped being entirely plausible somewhere around the 8th day at the garrison, when he had found her in the library at a late hour, still working on her timeline map, and had simply sat down across from her without asking, produced a second candle from somewhere, and worked in silence beside her for 2 hours, without requiring anything from her at all. It was such a small and ordinary thing. She had thought about it more than she intended to. His letter arrived 3 weeks after she returned to Thornfield. It was formal in structure, and written in the clean, precise hand she recognized. It covered the legal updates in the case against Lady Corva and Lord Cedric, both formally charged, the proceedings moving through the Crown court system toward conclusions that Molly's testimony and the gathered evidence made inevitable. It confirmed Evan's official restoration as ward of the Thornfield holding. It noted, in the last paragraph, that the Crown had reviewed the toll road revenues for the current year and found them consistent with estimates, which meant the territory was financially stable and would not require external management. And then, below the formal close, in the same hand but with a slightly different quality, as though it had been written after a pause, a single additional line. The garrison library has been considerably less useful since you stopped working in it. She read that line 3 times. Then she folded the letter carefully and placed it in the inner pocket of her riding cloak, beside the lavender vial and her father's letter, and sat for a while with the fire in the study hearth burning its honest amber. She wrote back the same evening. Her letter covered the legal matters in appropriate detail. Confirmed receipt of all documents, described Evan's adjustment to the holding and his genuine enthusiasm for the territorial accounts, which he had apparently been reviewing with the energy of someone given something real to do after years of enforced idleness. In the last paragraph, she wrote, "The Thornfield Library is small, and its chronicles are incomplete, but the south window is better than the garrison's, and the light in the afternoon is adequate for working. Should you find yourself in the Northern Territories and in need of somewhere to read maps in silence, the holding extends that courtesy to the Crown." She sealed it with her father's ring. She sent it the following morning with a rider wearing the Thornfield colors, which were, she had decided, still her colors, and would continue to be, alongside whatever came next. Orion arrived at the Thornfield holding 6 weeks later, in early spring, when the rosemary in the kitchen garden was putting out new growth and the frost had retreated from the south-facing stones. He came with a small party, Davin, Holt, and 4 guards, and the absence of ceremony was itself a form of statement. She met him in the courtyard. The afternoon light was the particular clear gold of early spring, and it caught the dark plaits of his hair and the worn leather of his bracers, and made the whole scene look, she thought, almost implausibly like something that had been arranged. She was wearing her own clothes, a gray wool dress with a brown leather belt, her braid loose over one shoulder, and she felt, for the first time in a long time, entirely like herself. He looked at her across the courtyard with those ice-gray eyes, and the quality of the look was different from the ones in the garrison and the council hall. It was the same attention, but it had stopped being careful in the same way. Something in it was simply present, and honest, and direct. "The library," he said. "South corridor, second door," she said. "The light is good until the 4th bell." "I know," he said. "I read your letter several times." She smiled. It was a small smile, the kind that comes before the full version, and it surprised her a little. Not its presence, but its ease. They walked into the holding together, and Evan met them at the door with the territorial accounts already under his arm, and an expression of determined competence that made Molly feel something so warm and uncomplicated that she simply let herself have it without examining it. Davin and Holt settled into the hall with the comfort of men who had traveled enough to know how to make any room workable. The spring light moved through the south-facing windows and touched the old stone and the worn wooden floors and the shelves of her father's books, and the holding felt, fully and without qualification, like a home. That evening in the library, Orion sat across from her at the broad wooden desk with a map between them and a candle burning at either side, and they discussed the road toll arrangements and the legal calendar and the final proceedings against Lady Corva, who had ultimately confessed under the weight of the Crown Court's evidence. Not fully, not without deflection, but enough. Enough for justice to be completed in proper form, with documents and witnesses and the irrevocable stamp of Crown record. Lord Cedric was stripped of his beta lordship and removed from the Northern Reaches Council. His family, after extensive review, were fined heavily and placed under Crown monitoring. The Seraphine whose name had surfaced in his sleep was, as it turned out, a woman from a merchant family to whom he had made promises long before Molly's name had entered his world, a detail that added one final layer to the portrait of a man who had treated other people's lives as adjustable variables. Molly filed this information, noted it, and declined to give it further space in her thinking. It was not the most important thing about what had happened to her, and she was no longer interested in organizing her interior life around the failures of men who had not deserved the room. After the documents were set aside and the candles had burned lower, and Evan had long since retired to his rooms, she and Orion sat for a while in the quiet of the library, the fire low, the spring dark outside the windows carrying the smell of wet earth and new growth through the slightly open shutter. "You should know," he said, "that I came before the legal calendar required it." "I know," she said, "and that I intend to return, regularly." She looked at the fire. The "The road toll records do require periodic Crown review," she said. "They do not require it this frequently," he said. And there was something in his voice that was the audible version of the almost reaction she had been watching for months. Except this time he let it complete, and it was quiet and certain and entirely him. She looked at him then, directly, the way she had learned to look at things she needed to see clearly, rather than comfortably. "I am not certain I am uncomplicated," she said. "I spent a long time being grateful for things that did not deserve gratitude, and then I stopped being grateful for anything as a correction. I am still finding the appropriate middle ground." "I am not looking for uncomplicated," he said. "I am looking for honest." She thought about that for a moment, about a man who had held her father's seal ring and spoken Crown witness in the old tongue, who had sat beside her in a garrison library without requiring anything, who had told her about his mother without performing grief, who had come to a modest holding in the Northern Territories in early spring before the legal calendar required it. "Then you have found it," she said. The fire settled. The shutter moved gently in the spring air. The library held them in its old paper and candle wax smell, and neither of them spoke for a while, because nothing further needed to be said tonight, and some things are better begun in silence. Lady Corva died in Crown custody 2 years later, before her full sentencing was completed. Not violently, but of the same kind of swift and specific illness that had taken Molly's father, which the Crown physicians examined carefully, and which the records noted with the careful language of official documents. Whether justice found her or simply coincidence, Molly chose not to dwell on it. She had stopped giving Corva space in her interior life well before that. Cedric lived out his years in quiet obscurity in a village far from any pack road, without title or council seat, or the name Seraphine in his life either, as she had ultimately chosen a man who had actually been present when she needed him. This seemed appropriate. Evan grew into the Thornfield holding with the particular rightness of someone returning to a place that had always been theirs. He was a capable and warm-hearted lord, much like their father, and the holding prospered under his management in ways that would have made Lord Aldrich quietly pleased. Molly became Luna of the Lycan Crown territories in the autumn of the following year, in a ceremony held in the Great Hall at Caldermere. Not the hall where the council had convened under difficult weight, but the same stone and candlelight, transformed by the particular alchemy of an occasion chosen rather than imposed. She wore deep blue again, her braid pinned with a silver clasp that had been her father's, and she carried no lavender. The vial was at home on the windowsill of the south-facing room she considered her own, where the afternoon light came in, and the rosemary grew below, and the holding carried on its honest, purposeful life. Orion placed his hands over hers during the ceremony, with the same steadiness he brought to everything. Not a performance of solemnity, but simply the genuine article. When he looked at her, it was with the full version of the attention she had first seen on a frost-pale forest road, and she looked back with all of herself present, nothing held at managed distance. She had been raised to be grateful and accommodating, and to find warmth in small things. She had learned that these were not weaknesses. They were capacities, and capacities correctly directed were a form of power. She had also learned that trust was not a flaw if it was given with clear eyes, to someone who had demonstrated, over time, in actions rather than promises, that they deserved it. She had found such a person. She had recognized him slowly, correctly, and without requiring herself to be faster than the truth allowed. The candles burned in the great hall of Caldermere, and the stone held the warmth of many fires, and Evan stood in the front of the gathered witnesses looking quietly undone with feeling, which he managed by studying his boots at intervals and then looking up again. Davin stood at Orion's side with his veteran's economy of expression. Marta was somewhere in the middle of the gathering, upright and dry-eyed, and looking at the proceedings with the satisfaction of someone who had told a woman to eat the broth and rest, and had been entirely vindicated. And outside the hall, through the high stone windows, the autumn sky was clear and enormous, and the forest below the ridge was turning all its colors at once. the way forests do in that season, amber and deep red, and the particular gold that belongs to afternoons that know they are ending and choose to be beautiful about it. Molly, daughter of Aldrich, Luna of the Lycan territories, wife of the Alpha King, looked at the man beside her and at the life that had been taken from her, and then, through her own precise and honest efforts, returned, and decided that this was not the end of anything. It was simply where the real story settled into itself, complete,